Hello and welcome back to another HOA Outdoors episode. Today we're going to be talking about camera surveys and how I do them and how I do them differently from a lot of people in the way that I'm not doing them over a pile of corn in August and in January, which is kind of the way a lot of people do them. They do them twice a year and they have them pile of corn and they see their buck to doe ratio, their age structure, all that stuff based off of August and July, or August and January, excuse me, when one, you're using the corn at that time because in most states it's not legal to bait. And so you have to do it before season and after season. Or if you are in a state that you're using or are allowed to bait and using corn over trail camera to get your camera surveys, it's still different from that because I'm not using food in my camera surveys. I'm using. I had a mock scrape up. You'll see in some of the pictures that a tree fell into the mock scrape, but this camera is facing an area in between what I thought was two buck bedding areas, and we'll get into the details. I have them all written down, all the stuff, all the data off of that camera. I have processed and written down, and I have it based into two types of grouping. I didn't look at doe in this camera survey. I just looked at the buck, and I looked at them just from here in Pennsylvania. The opening day was September the 18th, and the archery season, and the last day of the late flintlock season was January 29th. So that was my area I'm in southeastern Pennsylvania. We have the extended season, so it's a longer season, but those are the dates that I ran this camera survey from, and the information that we got was really interesting. Like I said, the camera was in a buck bedding area, but it was in between two, so we had a lot of pictures of deer going back and forth and using the camera. So what we found was, just to highlight the information, I had 54 total daylight buck pictures. And to qualify as a daylight picture, I went through and looked at the times it was of legal shooting hours. So if maybe the picture is dark, or maybe uh, maybe it's a little brighter for the time, or still flashing, I didn't use when it was a sunlight. I used by the legal shooting hours. So, and for it to be a buck, it had to be no questions asked. Well, if it's a blurry picture, it didn't count. Just 100% clear buck pictures. There were 54 daylight pictures, and there were 22 night pictures. So, what does that tell us? It tells us that, in my opinion, this is clearly an area that buck are using a lot during the hunting season and a lot during the daylight compared to at night, which means they are using this property. They're locating this is their central area of buck movement. This is one of the areas that they like to be in. It's an area they feel comfortable in, and it's obviously an area that we got a lot of pictures of deer. And the most interesting thing is what we'll get into as we go through the data and the numbers, is how this really changes. There's two general shifts that we see in the daylight movement and daylight activity of these deer, and it's extremely interesting when we get into why. The nighttime pictures, like I said, we went off of just shooting hours, so you might have another 5 minutes of light and 5 minutes earlier of light that we could have got pictures. I did everything conservative to the daylight pictures. So if it was on the border, it went to the night pictures. So it wasn't whether you could shoot or not. It was off of legal hours of shooting. So what we saw with this information, and it's really interesting. Starting September 19th, we get the first day was the 18th. They get any pictures. Starting the 19th, we started getting some, and this camera was up since July, so we had tons and tons of pictures on here. But what we saw was a gradual increase of buck movement, especially during the daylight and especially during the middle of the day, all the way up, and it really got hot right in that October 17th. October 17th was the day we had the most buck pictures on this camera. And you might go, well, that seems a little early, doesn't it? Like you expected more the end of October, beginning of November. What we saw on this camera was very little. There wasn't no doe movement, but very little doe pictures. A lot of the pictures, I would say, 2/3 to 75% were buck pictures, and out of those, 5/7 basically were daylight pictures. So this was an area that the bucks felt sacred in. They were using it, and they were using it a lot during that middle of October into later October, and then into just the beginning of November. So we had a gradual build to October 17th. Now, I went back and looked at the weather on October 16th. Here, where we were, we had the biggest change in temperature of all of October. It was something like 60 degrees. It was a 25-degree shift. So it was something like 60 degrees or so. It was 65 degrees. Was it 65 degrees? Yeah, 65 degrees the day of October 16th, and it dropped down to 40 at night on the morning of October 17th. So you had that 25, I guess that'd be, 25 degree shift from those mid 60s to the low 40s from that night, and that was the best day. We had deer on there. We had 5 separate pictures of daylight buck movement going through there, and that was a killer day, and it was the biggest shift of temperature from the whole month of October, and that was the money. Then we see again the 24th to 25th. They were hot again when you're getting closer there, and then the 2nd and 4th of November were really good. When we get to the 4th of November, that is where it gets really interesting. From the 5th of November to the 13th of November, when you get one daylight picture in here. And what that tells me is that this is the time that they really started spending in those doe bedding areas, whether they were chasing all day or most of the day, and or that's when our lockdown started. So I know off of other cameras, the 5th, November 5th, was the day that we had that big splitter buck that we were chasing up there. We had him all day on the 5th and into the 6th, and then that morning chasing one doe, and then staying with her and getting very limited pictures of him off other cameras until it was the 16th, I think, till we got another picture of him. So that can tell us that that is the start of our lockdown. So we know the 5th and 6th, maybe even the 7th, they're really just in those doe bedding areas, chasing doe, waiting for that first doe to go in the heat. And then probably somewhere around that 8th, 9th, 10th is when they're actually doing the majority of the breeding, and they're locked down with her for, that's usually about a week, which would put us right around that 13th, 14th, where they're away from her and they're looking again for those doe that haven't been bred. But that was our first just total drop off of pictures. It was constantly going. The 17th, like I said, it peaked, but I think that had more to do with the weather, and that the buck were ready to start chasing, but the doe obviously on the 17th were not receptive. So they were probably scent checking. They wanted to be ready. They were searching. They were hitting scrapes. That's what they were doing the 17th, but the doe weren't ready. And then we see that November 5th, 6th, 7th time period, probably when the first one of our, in where we were, in our area, our doe group, probably the first doe started going in the heat between the 5th and 7th. And then they'd be locked down after that for about a week, which would put us right around the 13th, 14th, 15th, which is when we start to see November 14th, 15th, 16th, they were up on their feet, back in this bedding area, back traveling between these two buck bedding areas probably searching again. And then November 19th, 20th, 21st, 22nd, and then the 24th, they were back there again. We had pictures of buck. So you can definitely tell where, okay, we had that build up to the rut constantly through mid-October, beginning of October. We're building. We're getting to the 17th because we're in a buck bedding area where this camera was. That's your build-up point to that mid to late October. That giant cold front, it hit. We had an explosion. They were ready to go. The doe were not though. They were not. They were clearly you're almost 2 weeks before, but the buck, like, boys will be boys. They're ready to go. They were on their feet, and then we have that giant shift in that November 5th to the 13th where they're locked down. They're breeding the doe. They are all with them all the time, and then we see that continuation of right after that November 14th. It starts all over again, and we're building, and we're building, and we're building, and we're building until November 27th. And November 27th, why this is a big day? It's the opening day of Pennsylvania gun season. That's what it was this year. It's November 27th. So we had then, after the first day, we didn't get another buck picture during daylight on this camera till December the 20th. Now, two things happened, in my opinion. The buck did not leave the property because we have pictures of them all through rifle season, just on a different part of the property. What started happening was, in my opinion, during gun season, the doe on this property, if doe will put up with a lot more stress, won't put up with as good as cover for the majority of the year. When they know it's gun season, and deer do know, I've seen it now year in and year out, they know when gun season hits. They can hear the gun. They're not dumb. They hear the gunshots. They feel the pressure on this property. Probably the neighbors on some area of the property. I don't know which neighbors. Not that they came in, but they probably weren't watching their wind, and they probably blew their wind into these areas where the doe were bedded, and they could tell, okay, there's a difference. There's more people in the woods. There's gunshots, so they knew that it was gun season. They knew that it was gun season. They knew that that time of the year had started, so they shifted into these buck bedding areas because they wanted to get into tighter, thicker, nastier cover. And not that the buck didn't leave these bedding areas, but what we saw was the buck shift to more of the center of the south-facing, thickest area of the property. And I don't think it was because they were necessarily south-facing slopes. I think that's the heart of this property is it starts on a northern, wraps around to the eastern, and then the southern slope is the longest, most continuous area of thick bedding cover. And I think that area of the property is pretty sacred to buck for the majority of the season, where they're used to not having doe back there, but it is the thickest, nastiest cover. And when those doe feel that pressure, they start to shift into the edges of these buck bedding areas. And buck do not want that social pressure, especially during a very high, intense, stressful period like the rifle season. So what we had ended up having happen was, in my opinion, these doe took the first area where the buck started to bed, and they started bedding there, which shifted these buck. And a lot of these buck on this camera were 2-year-olds and yearlings. There was maybe 1 or 2 3-year-olds, probably only one, and then obviously the big 4-year-old splitter buck. This is not a part of the country where the age class, we do not have a ton of 5 and 6-year-olds, if many at all. This is a heavy hunted area in Pennsylvania. The majority of our older deer are 2, 3, and 4-year-olds. So to have a decent amount of 2-year-olds on your property in this part of Pennsylvania is saying something, and then to have a 4-year-old, which is probably one of the oldest deer on here. He acts completely different from all the other 2-year-olds and even some of the 3-year-olds. But these buck that were in these bedding areas, most of them were 2-year-olds or yearlings, And not that there's anything wrong with that. They gotta have somewhere to bed too. But this was the first in your depth of cover. This area was somewhere there's a doe bedding area. This was in between those first, what I thought was buck bedding area, not the main uh, excluded area that 4-year-old buck I think calls home, and he really uses a lot of the season, especially during daylight. Um, it wasn't that area. It was a little, probably about 200 to 300 yards closer to the field, to the third that main feeding area than where I would expect he's bedding the majority of the time. But what happens was when those doe felt those pressure, they moved into that first buck bedding area, that really thick stuff, and pushed these deer back more into the deepest, thickest part of the property. And the buck we saw it in late season when I was hunting. And I had a couple good encounters in late season with buck. They seem to be not all together, but they seem to be very bunched up, and on that southern facing slope. So I think the majority of it was hunting pressure, but I think the other thing was we did have a very cold December and January. So they're going to get the most sunlight on this south facing slope compared to an eastern slope, which they'll get in the morning a little bit, but you won't get those days that are, we had days in the 20s. In January, we had days in the single digits with wind chills. There was one day I hunted where I think the wind chill was minus 10, something like that, in that the 10th or 11th of January. So it was real cold. So I think that had a lot to do with them shifting the hunting pressure, knowing it's gun season, bump those doe up into the first buck bedding areas that we have on the property, and bump those buck back into the main quote unquote main buck area that's really excluded from a lot of the deer. But I think that's the reason that we didn't see any pictures in there from daylight pictures from November 27th till December 20th. And then the 20th, 21st, and then the January 6th, we started to get more buck pictures building. And then the 22nd of January, which was still in our season, we had 4 pictures of buck in there again. Now they were all yearlings, but they were together. They were in there. Obviously, there were 4 separate pictures of them in there, and they were all yearlings. But it just showed us that they started to use this again. And then the 24th, we actually had that big splitter buck come through in there, and that was the last hardhorn. That was the last antlered picture I got of him. Was the 24th of January, and that was early in the morning, like 5 o'clock. Going back to bed clearly, and it was just interesting data that I thought I should share with you guys. How there was a ton of early to rut season activity in this area, and there were deer going everywhere. And we had that build up, and then we had the lockdown, which was major, and then we had them seeking out again until gun season. And then that was our major just drop off, complete change of patterns. And you see how these deer go into a different survival mode when gun season hits, especially in high pressured states. So I think that's interesting how that happens. Now, like I said, I do not own this property that we hunt. We are blessed with the opportunity that we have to hunt this property. I do not own it. If it was mine, the 2 things that I would have here change would be definitely the adding more thick cover closer to the field edge. Having that, just that the doe don't feel like they have to come into that first buck bedding area, which it's a buck bedding area because it was timbered a couple of years ago and it's really thick. It's not, we didn't necessarily, it's that way because we don't bump these doe in archery season. We don't push them back and back and back in the property. We let them bed closer to the field edge, which allows us to have that depth of cover throughout the property. That would be the first thing. I would add 50 to 75 yards right off the woods, really thick, dense cover, so those doe feel safe and can bed there all year round. Whether that's hinge cuts, whether that's just cutting a flush cut and getting just that sunlight to the ground, or whether that's planting stuff like willows, or even though it's invasive, um, even honeysuckle. I'm not saying plant honeysuckle. I'm just saying if you have honeysuckle on your property, don't cut it down. I know it's an invasive, but 300 years ago there weren't 40 and 50 acres of standing soybeans all year round for the deer. So that's a topic for another video. Natives and non-natives, but don't cut honeysuckle down. I would never cut honeysuckle down. It's just, I might get hate. I'm probably gonna get a lot of hate for that. That's not natural, but neither is rows and rows of manicured soybeans and corn and grain. But now we're just going off the deep end, so that's a topic for another video. But I would have a more defined third feeding area, better food plots, and I think those two things would allow those doe to feel even more comfortable. And when they leave the bedding areas, they're stepping out into a field that's completely open. The corn's cut. There's no height. There's no structure to it. So I think if you had switchgrass and some standing corn and some standing sorghum, they would feel much more comfortable coming out into these green food sources than just a 20-acre field of just green rye, I think the farmer plants barley, young barley. Then they'd feel a lot more spooky than if they had more of that cover in the field with switchgrass and with standing grain and just more structure to it. But again, that's a topic for another video of how to improve that property. But it was really interesting. And then we know for sure we had a decent amount of buck make it through the season. We had pictures of them, a couple of nice shed bucks in late February. I'm sorry, and then we even had a couple hard horned into the beginning of March. So we know that a couple of them, we were able to get a couple deer in the next age class. Hopefully we'll have a couple nice 3-year-olds on the property next year, and hopefully that, from what all signs show, the splitter buck should be a 5-year-old next year and should be a fun deer to chase. But that's how I do my camera surveys, and that's what I take off of the data that I've collected. It's a different way of doing it, but I think it's more effective, and I think you're going to learn a lot more than from having bait piles in August and bait piles in January and seeing, which deer is here and why are they here. This is a full season of data during the hunting season. We see the shifts and we see the changes, where in August, a lot of those deer in August are still in their summer patterns. They're not even hard-horned, and we all know that deer are completely different hard-horned than they are in velvet. And then in January, they might be there because it's a south-facing slope and hunting season's over and it's warm, not because the cover is great, not because the food's great, but because that's where they are to survive. Where you might have a thick, overgrown cedar thicket or white spruce or of pine trees that's way overgrown that they won't use much other time. But if it's cold in the end of January and they got to get in there to survive, to stay warm, well, that's why they're in there, and they might not be there the rest of the season. So I think this way is the best way to see actual data during the hunting season. August and January is great to see which deer are going to or might be there or in the area, and then which deer survived in January. But this is to get a total camera survey. This camera's not moved, this camera's not touched. This was a cell camera, so I did know a lot of the information, but not all of it, because it was in a kind of a iffy area. Sometimes it had signal, sometimes it didn't. But it taught us a lot about buck movement and how the rut really affects the buck movement, and then obviously during the gun season. So I hope you guys learned a lot. I hope this information will help you on your own properties, or at least knowing what to look for or what to expect from where you are in the whitetails range, whether you're in the south or in the north or Canada, wherever you are. That there are shifts, and the shifts in Pennsylvania might not be the same that they are in another state, another area. But this is just what I saw, and I think in the northern part of the country, I think a lot of these white-tailed deer act the same as far as the when the rut takes place. I mean, we all know that the beginning of November is that chasing period, and those that 8th, ninth, 10th, a lot of times they're locked down. So it just proved that more, but it really helped us in our location know that starting the 5th, 6th, and 7th, they're really going to be in there chasing doe, and then more the 7th, 8th, ninth, 10th in there starting to get locked down, and then coming out of it the 13th, 14th, 15th in there. So a lot of good data that you wouldn't have gotten if it was just a bait pile in August and a bait pile in January. So thanks for watching. Have a good day, and I hope this information you can use it on your own farm or your own property to know when the deer should be moving. Like I said, the major thing though, that major cold front in October is something, if you have the buck bedding on your property, that major, I'd say after the 14th, 15th of October, that next major cold front in October is something that you have to hunt. And we see that, and hopefully we won't miss it next year. So have a great day, and God bless.